Once upon a time, in the hills of Ephraim there lived a woman named Peninnah, a wife, a mother, and a woman who should have been happy. Her husband Elkanah was a good man, kind, generous, and a man of faith. He had wealth, a strong household, and children who played at her feet, filling their home with laughter. And yet, Peninnah's heart was never at peace. Because no matter how many children she bore, no matter how diligently she ran her household, no matter how much she tried to please him, she would never be the wife he truly loved. That place in his heart belonged to Hannah. Peninnah sat by the fire, carefully braiding her daughter's hair as the scent of roasting meat filled the air. Elkanah was returning soon, and the household was busy with preparations for the meal. The servants moved quickly, setting the table, stirring pots, baking fresh loaves of bread. Her children played nearby, their laughter echoing against the stone walls, but Peninnah's gaze drifted toward the doorway, where the warm light of evening spilled across the threshold. Soon he would be home, and so would she. Her hands tightened around the strands of her daughter's hair. She should not feel this way. She should not feel like an outsider in her own home. She should not resent the woman who had never once raised her voice against her, the woman who had never fought for Elkanah's affections, but who had captured them without even trying. But she did, because Hannah was the wife Elkanah loved. And Peninnah? She was just the other one. When the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, Peninnah rose swiftly, brushing dust from her skirt. "Elkanah is coming!" one of the servants called. Her children squealed with delight, running toward the entrance of the house. Peninnah followed, schooling her expression into something calm, composed, welcoming. And then he entered. Elkanah stepped inside, his robe dusty from travel, his eyes bright as he greeted the children who clung to his arms. His gaze swept over the household, over Peninnah, and then it landed on her, Hannah. She had arrived beside him, her movements quiet, hesitant, her expression unreadable. There was something about her, something fragile, something untouched by time, that made it impossible to ignore her presence. Elkanah's entire demeanor softened. His gaze, his posture, even his voice as he turned to speak to her, it all changed, like she was the only one in the room. Peninnah's stomach twisted. She forced herself to smile, to turn away, to busy herself with the meal as if she had not noticed, as if she were not aching. The evening feast was a celebration. Servants poured wine into goblets. The smell of spiced lamb filled the air, and the flickering light of oil lamps cast golden hues over the stone walls. The sound of laughter and conversation rang through the house, and Elkanah sat at the head of the table, his eyes filled with contentment. Peninnah watched him closely, memorizing every detail, the curve of his smile, the way his hands moved as he spoke, the warmth in his voice as he laughed. He was a good man, a husband who provided for her, who had given her children, who had never once raised his hand or spoken a cruel word. But she wanted more. She wanted his heart, and she would never have it. Because across the table, Hannah sat in silence, barely touching her food. And Elkanah noticed. He turned to her, leaning in, his voice lower, concerned. "Why do you weep, Hannah?" he asked softly. "Why do you not eat? Why is your heart troubled?" Peninnah clenched her jaw. Not once had he ever spoken to her like that. Not once had he ever pleaded for her happiness. And then, his next words cut deeper than she expected. "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Peninnah's breath caught in her throat. Not 10 sons. Not the children Peninnah had given him, the life she had built for him, the family she had given her very body to create. Number. It was Hannah's pain that moved him, not Peninnah's devotion. It was Hannah's sadness that made him speak softly, not the mother of his children who had spent years at his side. She dropped her gaze to her plate, suddenly sick with resentment. Why? Why could he not love her like that? Why was she never enough? That night, Peninnah sat in the quiet of her chamber. The laughter of the feast long faded, the house settling into deep silence. And she let herself feel. The loneliness, the bitterness, the longing for something that would never be hers. And yet, even as she sat there, wiping silent tears from her eyes, she knew she was still his wife. She was still the mother of his children, and she would not be forgotten. No matter what it took, she would make him see her. She would not disappear in Hannah's shadow. And so, with a deep breath, Peninnah lifted her chin, her heart hardening just a little more. Tomorrow she would smile. Tomorrow she would remind Hannah of what she lacked. Tomorrow she would make sure that the wife Elkanah loved would never forget the wife who bore his sons. For if she could not have his heart, she would at least have his legacy. The morning light spilled through the narrow windows, casting golden streaks across the stone floor. The house was already alive with noise, children's laughter, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of servants preparing the day's work. Peninnah sat near the hearth, carefully weaving a basket, her fingers moving swiftly. She should have felt at peace, surrounded by the warmth of her children, in the comfort of her home. But all she could think about was Hannah. Hannah, who sat alone. Hannah, who did not have to busy herself with endless tasks, who had the luxury of slipping away to pray, to mourn, to bask in Elkanah's concern. Peninnah's hands tightened around the weaving fibers. Number. She would not let herself feel sorry for her. She had spent years bearing Elkanah's children, building his household, strengthening his name, yet it was Hannah's empty womb that stirred his compassion. And Peninnah had had enough. The journey to Shiloh was long, the road stretching over rolling hills, dust rising beneath their caravan of donkeys and carts. Every year, Elkanah took his family to the tabernacle to offer sacrifices to the Lord and celebrate the festival. For Peninnah, it was a display of status, a chance to walk through the temple courts with her children by her side, a reminder to the others of who she was, Elkanah's wife, the mother of his heirs. For Hannah, it was nothing but grief. Peninnah saw it in the way her shoulders hunched, in the way her hands remained folded tightly in her lap, her eyes cast downward. The sight gnawed at Peninnah, a strange mix of satisfaction and anger curling in her chest. She should feel victorious, knowing she had everything Hannah longed for, but instead, she felt something bitter, something ugly. And so, as they arrived at the tabernacle, as the aroma of roasted meat filled the air, as Elkanah prepared the portions to distribute among his family, Peninnah struck where she knew it would hurt the most. She leaned in, her voice sweet as honey, sharp as a blade. "It must be hard for you, Hannah," she murmured, "to sit here, year after year, with nothing to offer, to have no children to bring before the Lord." Hannah's breath hitched, her fingers clenching in her lap. Peninnah pressed forward, her lips curving into something cruel. "Tell me," she continued, tilting her head, "does it ever feel like he has forgotten you?" Hannah stiffened, her knuckles white. Across the courtyard, Elkanah was watching. Peninnah's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly hid it beneath a sip of wine, casting her gaze downward in false innocence. She had done what she intended. Hannah would spend the evening weeping, as she always did. And Elkanah. He would chase after her, just like he always did. Peninnah should have felt satisfied. But later that evening, as the feasting died down, as the lamps flickered lower, she caught sight of Hannah slipping away, alone. She watched as Hannah moved toward the tabernacle, disappearing into the dim torchlight. Her steps hurried, her shoulders shaking. Something in Peninnah twisted painfully. She did not know why. Hannah had always wept. This was not new. And yet, tonight felt different. Tonight, Hannah was not just crying, she was praying. Something about it unsettled Peninnah, but she pushed it away, shaking her head, returning to the warmth of the gathering. Let her cry. Let her beg the Lord for what he had already given to me. Tomorrow would come, and Hannah would still be barren, and Peninnah would still be Elkanah's wife. Wouldn't she? The night air was thick with the scent of burning oil and the distant hum of festival prayers, but Peninnah could not sleep. She lay in her chamber, staring at the ceiling, the soft rise and fall of her children's breaths, the only sound filling the quiet. She should have been content. She should have felt victorious, having reminded Hannah yet again of her barrenness, her emptiness, her place beneath Peninnah in Elkanah's household. But something felt different this time. There was a weight in her chest, a discomfort that would not fade. Hannah had always wept at these festivals, had always taken her grief into the shadows of the temple. But tonight, Hannah had not just wept, she had prayed. Peninnah had seen it. The way Hannah had moved with purpose, the way she had clutched her robes, lips moving without sound, eyes lifted toward the heavens as if she were speaking directly to God himself. And worst of all, Peninnah had seen Eli the priest watching. Something stirred in her gut at the memory, but she shoved it away. She would not be afraid of Hannah's prayers. What could prayer do? If God had not answered her by now, why would he change his mind? Peninnah clenched her jaw and turned onto her side. Tomorrow, things would be as they always were, wouldn't they? The morning dawned clear and bright, the temple courts alive with travelers preparing for their return home. Peninnah stood beside Elkanah, her children gathered at her side, watching. Hannah had returned. She stood near the entrance of the tabernacle, her face different somehow, lighter, steadier, unshaken. Peninnah frowned. Hannah should have looked broken. She should have been avoiding everyone's gaze, the way she had every year before. But she wasn't. Instead, Elkanah was speaking to her. Peninnah couldn't hear what was being said, but she saw it. The warmth in his eyes, the gentle way he touched her shoulder, the way Hannah did not flinch or pull away. And then, something else. A flicker of movement. Eli the priest stood at a distance, watching Hannah with approval. Peninnah's stomach twisted. Number. Something had changed. Something had been set into motion, and for the first time in years, Peninnah felt something she had never expected to feel. Fear. The journey home was quiet. Elkanah rode ahead, his mind lost in thought, while the children dozed beside Peninnah in the cart. And Hannah sat in silence, her hands resting lightly over her belly as if she were already cradling something unseen. Peninnah clenched her fists. She did not know why, but deep in her bones, she felt it. Hannah's prayer had been heard. And soon, everything would change. The days turned to weeks and the weeks into months, and soon, Peninnah knew she had been right to be afraid, because Hannah had changed. She was no longer the woman who sat in silence at the feast, no longer the woman who flinched under Peninnah's sharp words. She did not avoid the marketplace, did not shrink away when the women of the village passed by. No, Hannah walked with purpose now, her eyes bright, her face glowing with something Peninnah could not understand. Hope. And then, one evening, Elkanah returned home with news that made Peninnah's world tilt. Hannah was with child. Peninnah stood in the courtyard, her heart pounding so loudly she could hardly hear the voices around her. It was impossible! It was impossible! She had been so sure that the Lord had closed Hannah's womb forever, that she would always remain the childless wife, the forgotten one. And yet, Hannah was carrying a child. Peninnah's hands clenched into fists. She had spent years watching Elkanah dote on Hannah, giving her double portions at the feast, comforting her when she cried, speaking to her with the tenderness he never showed Peninnah. But now that Hannah was pregnant, Peninnah felt the walls she had built around herself crumble. She had always told herself that she was the true wife, that Hannah's love from Elkanah meant nothing because it had given her nothing in return. But now, Hannah would have a son. And everything Peninnah had used to define herself, her children, her position in the household, her status, felt as if it was slipping through her fingers. The months passed, and Peninnah tried to pretend that nothing had changed. She carried on with her daily tasks, tended to her children, busied herself in the market, but no matter where she went, the whispers followed her. The Lord has blessed Hannah. The barren woman has been lifted up. Hannah is finally carrying Elkanah's heir. Peninnah could hardly breathe beneath the weight of it. It wasn't just that Hannah had conceived, it was that God had given her what Peninnah thought would never be hers. And if the Lord had chosen to bless Hannah, what did that say about Peninnah? Was she no longer the favored one? Had she ever been? The night Hannah went into labor, the household filled with the sounds of rushing footsteps and whispered prayers. The midwives hurried past Peninnah without sparing her a glance, their arms full of cloth and water, their faces alight with anticipation, not fear. And Elkanah? He never left Hannah's side. Peninnah sat alone in the next room, the voices of the midwives muffled through the walls, the fire casting flickering shadows on the stone floor. She was used to hearing the cries of childbirth. She had birthed many children herself, after all. But this was different. This child was different, because when Hannah's cries finally broke into laughter, when the wail of a newborn filled the house, Peninnah knew the truth she had refused to acknowledge for years. Hannah was no longer the lesser wife. She had been lifted up by the Lord himself. And Peninnah? She was no longer sure where that left her. The next morning, the servants whispered that Hannah had named the child Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." And for the first time, Peninnah understood. She had never truly been the one Elkanah loved. But worse than that, she had never been the one God had chosen, and that truth hurt more than all the years of being unseen. The sounds of celebration rang through the household, the voices of the servants and midwives carrying the joy of Hannah's miracle to every corner of their home. Peninnah sat in the courtyard, her fingers resting idly in the folds of her dress, her ears catching every whispered blessing spoken over the child. The Lord has remembered her. Hannah, the barren one, has been lifted up. The woman who was once empty is now full. Peninnah's hands tightened into fists. Once, those words had been spoken over her. Once, she had been the one who had given Elkanah sons and daughters, the one who had secured his legacy, the one who had been looked upon as a woman blessed by God. But now, it was Hannah who held the child. And it was Hannah whom Elkanah gazed upon with adoration, standing by her side, running a gentle hand over the baby's tiny head as he whispered soft words Peninnah could not hear. For years, Peninnah had mocked Hannah's barrenness, convincing herself that her own worth came from her children. But now she realized the truth. Hannah had never needed sons to be loved. She had never needed children to have Elkanah's heart. And Peninnah, even with all of her sons, all of her daughters, all of her years of trying to be enough, she had never truly had his heart at all. That night Peninnah sat alone, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the shadows flickering against the walls like ghosts of the past. She had spent so many years fighting for Elkanah's love, fighting for her place in the household, fighting for something that had never truly belonged to her. Had it all been in vain? Had she spent her life grasping for something she could never truly hold? For the first time, Peninnah felt tired of trying to prove herself, tired of fighting for a man who had never fought for her in return, tired of resenting a woman who had never sought to harm her, only to be loved by God. And as she sat there, the truth settled deep into her chest, pressing into her like the weight of the night itself. This was never about Elkanah. This was never about who was the better wife, who had more children, who held more status. This had always been about God. And Peninnah? She had never once asked for his love, never once knelt before him, pouring out her soul as Hannah had done, never once sought the favor of God over the favor of man. For years she had thought that her worth came from bearing sons. But Hannah had shown her that true worth came from something far greater, from being seen by the Lord himself. And Peninnah, for all her striving, had never sought to be seen by him. The next morning, Peninnah watched as Hannah cradled her newborn son, her face radiant with peace Peninnah had never known. And for the first time, Peninnah did not feel anger. She did not feel the need to remind Hannah of all the years she had suffered. She did not feel the desire to mock or belittle. Instead, she felt something entirely new, something she did not yet have words for, a quiet surrender. Because she knew now. The Lord had seen Hannah. But he had also seen her. And if she could let go of the bitterness, if she could stop fighting for something that was never meant to be hers, well, perhaps the Lord might lift her up too. The sun rose high over Ramah, golden light spilling over the hills and warming the earth beneath Peninnah's feet. She stood at a distance, watching as Hannah walked toward the tabernacle, her arms wrapped gently around her son. Samuel. That was the name Hannah had given him. Because I asked the Lord for him. Peninnah should have felt anger. She should have felt the same bitterness, the same resentment she had carried for years, but instead she felt something else entirely, something strange and unfamiliar, peace. The household had been buzzing for days, the news spreading like wildfire. Hannah was dedicating her son to the Lord. Peninnah had been stunned when she first heard it. After all these years of longing for a child, she is giving him away? It made no sense. Or maybe it made all the sense in the world. Peninnah thought of the night at Shiloh when Hannah had disappeared into the temple, her lips moving in silent prayer, her body trembling with emotion. She had not been begging God for a son to prove herself. She had not been praying for status or validation or revenge. She had only wanted to be seen by him. And now she was keeping her promise. She had given Samuel to the Lord before he was even born, and now she would give him back. Peninnah watched as Elkanah walked beside Hannah, his step slow and reverent. They carried gifts, a sacrifice of a bull, flour, and wine, an offering to the God who had answered Hannah's cry. But Hannah? She carried the greatest offering of all. She was giving her only son. A gift not out of obligation, but out of love. Peninnah's throat tightened. She had spent years trying to prove herself, years fighting for a love she could never truly win, years mocking Hannah's emptiness just to make her own feel less heavy. But now, as she watched Hannah walk away with everything Peninnah had once thought she wanted, she did not feel jealousy. She did not feel rage. She did not feel the need to tear Hannah down. She only felt a quiet understanding. Perhaps Hannah had never been her enemy. Perhaps the real enemy had been her own bitterness. And for the first time in her life, Peninnah whispered a prayer of her own. Not for status, not for validation, not for love, but simply, Lord, see me too. And deep in her heart, she knew. He already had. The house felt different without Samuel's presence. It should have been quieter, emptier, more sorrowful, and yet it was not. Hannah did not weep in the night. She did not retreat into herself as Peninnah had seen her do for so many years. Instead, she rejoiced. Her voice filled the house, lifting in praise, thanking the Lord for what he had done. My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted high in him. The bows of the mighty are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Peninnah listened from the other room, her heart tightening with every word. She had spent so long believing Hannah was weak, but now she saw the truth. Hannah was not weak. Hannah had never been weak. She had been waiting on the Lord, waiting on his timing, and now she was full. Not because of Samuel, not because of Elkanah, but because of God himself. Peninnah swallowed hard, staring at the empty loom in front of her, her fingers gripping the fabric in her lap. For years, she had fought to prove herself, to demand love, to secure her place in the household. For years, she had believed that bearing children was what gave her value. But what if her worth had never been about that at all? Days turned to weeks, and Peninnah watched Hannah change, not in grief, not in sorrow, but in joy, in peace. And Peninnah wanted to understand why. One morning, as the household stirred awake, Peninnah found herself standing in the courtyard, watching Hannah kneel beside the fire, whispering her morning prayers. She hesitated. Then, for the first time in her life, she approached her. Hannah looked up surprised, but she did not pull away. Peninnah had expected bitterness, rejection, or even anger. Instead, Hannah smiled. Peninnah took a breath, forcing the words out before she could stop herself. How did you do it? Hannah tilted her head. Do what? Peninnah's throat tightened. Give him away. Hannah studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then she answered, because I knew he was never truly mine. He was always the Lord's. Peninnah felt something crack inside her chest. She had spent so long clinging to what she thought was hers, Elkanah's love, her children, her position in the household. But had she ever truly given anything to the Lord? Had she ever trusted him instead of herself? She did not know, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. That night, Peninnah lay awake, staring up at the ceiling, her thoughts turning over and over. She had spent so long fighting. But maybe She didn't have to fight anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she could do what Hannah had done. Maybe she could kneel before the Lord. Maybe she could pray, not for validation, not for approval, but simply to be seen, to be loved by the one who had always been watching. And so, as the house lay in silence, as the oil lamps flickered low, Peninnah finally prayed, "Lord, see me too." And this time, she knew. He already had.